for the period until you live a seen life again. In other words, in that whole period of latency, you remain in one state. This is very understandable, and there is no difficulty in proving it, because we know through our experience of living life that the only thing that changes us from one state to another, from anger, say, to hunger or to rapture, is some influence from our environment. And once we move into the phase of latency, there is nothing in the environment which can influence us. Therefore, we stay right there in that state until we become a seen or living entity again. This is what he means when he says, our hands are firmly gripped by hellhounds. If we die in the state of hell, the hellhounds will grip our hands and hold us there until something in our environment can change us out of that state when we are living a seen life again. The 10 kings of hell, who he mentions here, who pass judgment, and the heavenly messengers are an explanation in legendary terms of the law of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect. The heavenly messengers are the two little men who sit on our shoulders from the moment we're born, one on each side, and report to the heavenly gods, in legendary terms, exactly what we're doing, whether we're making a good cause or whether we're making a bad cause. In other words, they symbolize the instantaneous working of the law of cause and effect in our lives. One who does not have faith in the Lotus Sutra is an important line to carefully understand. This does not mean that if you don't practice true Buddhism, you'll fall into hell automatically, of course. But it does mean that if you don't understand the law of cause and effect at work in life, you'd have every chance of doing so unless you're very careful. Of course, there are plenty of people who do a great deal of good in their lives, who do not practice Buddhism, but make many good causes. And such people will certainly not die in the state of hell. But there are, I believe, many more people who, because of the strength of the pull of the three evil paths, hell, hunger, animality, and certainly anger, may find themselves in hell as a result of the causes that they've made in their lifetime. So this is what Nichiren Daishonin means when he says one who does not have faith in the Lotus Sutra. It's not specifically practicing true Buddhism, but it's someone who in one way or another through their lives create bad causes and disharmony, who hurt people, who kill people, who stamp on people's faces in order to achieve their own ends, who bully and oppress. This is all against the law of life, whether those people practice Buddhism or not. And the law of cause and effect, of course, is working in all of life, not just in the lives of Buddhists. Now the main tendency normally, you have a main tendency in your life, and it is this main tendency which is most likely to be the state that you will die in. All right? So, as we said, many people do a lot of good. But one of the sadnesses is that people who do a great deal of good often exhaust themselves in the process, either mentally or physically. Not in every case, of course. But we hear a great deal outside of Buddhism about sacrifice. And the process of trying to do good is, or can be, very exhausting indeed. So often people do sacrifice themselves. People who do a great deal of good through their lives, to our utter sorrow we see sick and ill towards the end of their lives. Or in other cases, people who do great good, we seem to so often see dying sometimes in loneliness and poverty and misery. All over the place you see such things. And the reason is, as Nichiren Daishonin explains, that such people exhaust their life force and they have no means of replenishing it. So of course in Buddhism the practice is to generate life force. Therefore it is possible for people up to the very moment of death to be fighting in the front line of the Battle of Causton. When one realizes all this, one begins to realize what incredible good fortune we have, that we found this Gohonzon and Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, that we can live busy lives with every minute becoming more and more valuable, and yet still remain healthy and strong and vigorous up to the moment of death. This is incredible good fortune. So, just to conclude this paragraph on hell, I'd like to read one extract of Sensei's speech which concerns hell in this life. The other day I read an article by Junichi Watanabe, a physician turned writer, describing the behavior of an eminent surgeon when faced with his own death. He was an expert in abdominal surgery, and this man had treated thousands of cancer cases. Then, ironically, he was found to have cancer himself. The discovery came too late, and he could do nothing but await his own death. He remained calm and composed at first, but as his disease worsened, he began to change. At midnight, a low growl would come from his room, and then suddenly he would shout, screaming at the top of his voice, "No, no, I don't want to die. Help me, help me." The nurses would rush into his room and find the doctor in tears, kicking his legs and beating his fists against the bed like a child. Sometimes he would take things off the bedstand and throw them across the room. At other times, his eyes filled with hatred, he would just lie and glare at his elderly wife, who stayed in the same room to look after him, and at the nurses who treated him. The next day, the doctor would wake up and look around with eyes hollow and gaunt, as if he had just escaped from hell. When an occasional visitor came, he would hardly say anything at all. At such times, he seemed like a man who was looking death calmly in the face. But when night came, he would again lose all control and become violent, as if he had transformed into a Mr. Hyde. It seemed as if he was being alternately tormented by his daytime exhaustion and nightly hell. The physicians were completely taken aback. They had never seen anyone struggle with such desperate fear of death as the doctor. Unable to remain indifferent, someone suggested that religion might perhaps give him some consolation. However, he was in no condition to accept any religious faith whatsoever, and he continued to writhe in agony. Was the doctor more frightened or cowardly than other people? No. There was no one who thought that, but there was no hope of his being cured. Death would definitely take him in a few more weeks, and he knew it better than anyone else. The problem was that he was all too clearly aware of the fact. He was like a criminal in a death row. In a way, he was even worse. Even a condemned criminal still has that one chance in 1,000 for reprieve, some slight hope that somehow his sentence might not be carried out. For the doctor, however, there wasn't the tiniest glimmer of hope that he would live. He knew too much about medicine to expect any such thing. He had devoted himself to medicine, and for several decades had studied and accumulated professional knowledge. But all his knowledge was now completely worthless. All it did was to serve to make him more painfully aware of his own death. He had diagnosed and operated on thousands of cancer cases. All this experience only told him that he would soon breathe his last. There was not the slightest possibility for survival in which he could believe. His precious learning had turned into a demon that did nothing but torture him. In despair even more intense than that of a condemned criminal, the doctor continued to writhe and cry in anguish until he finally breathed his last, as if exhausted of all his abusive language. There was no longer the slightest vestige of the lofty-minded scholar. Here was but an ordinary old man, egotistic and suspicious of everything, thrashing about in the horror of death. Sorry, that's fairly harrowing, but it does make clear the awful state of hell, especially in the last period of one's life. A little further on, Sensei said, "Reading this story, I realized afresh how wonderful it is to be able to live aware of the philosophy of eternal life expounded by Nichiren Daishonin. Learning, genius, power, wealth, reputation, science, technology, all become as nothing when confronted by death. When faced with this end, with his end, man finds himself hopelessly overpowered and with nothing able to salve his conscience." Nichikan Shonin, who was a very famous high priest of Nichiren Shoshu, the 26th, wrote this: "Unless you master the essential practice for freeing yourself from illusion and suffering, at the moment of death, all ordinary learning is completely useless. At the last moment of your life, you should chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo." So I think that sums up satisfactorily the paragraph on hell. We'll go on to something else now.
Just imagine that those 1,000 Buddhas extending their hands to all of Nichiren's disciples who chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo are like sweet melons or fragrant moonflowers extending their slender vines.
Thank you. So again, there is reference to the 1,000 Buddhas, which you remember means not only the Buddha's state and influence in the state of death, but also those who are revealing the Buddha tendency in this life. The friends who chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So this paragraph is an important one for anyone who has responsibility in our organization. The slender vines means the link of life that exists between every human being and between every human being and everything else that has life. These are the slender vines, the delicate thread which connects every single one of us to each other. So through our daimoku and our prayers and our active and actual encouragement, we can help and encourage each other. You remember Mr. Izumi sent a message to us on the World Peace Day in January, and he said we should regard every one of our friends as if they were the only friend that we have. This is really caring. For everybody, life has ups and downs. For every single one of us, there are times when we're facing turning points. Quite popular at the moment, I believe. There are obstacles and difficulties appearing at all sorts of times in our lives. At those times, we need help. We need encouragement. And if we fail to do so, then we are failing in one of the great practices of the Bodhisattva, compassion. Of course, to do this, we have to struggle with ourselves. That's why it's so important that we should do it. It's not only for one's friends, but it's also for oneself. Through struggling to overcome one's selfishness and to chant Daimoku and take action to help other people who are struggling, we do our own human revolution and change our unhappy karma. So like everything in Buddhism, it's perfectly balanced. What we give, we get back, cause and effect. So this caring attitude is very, very important. Sometimes, of course, caring means speaking quite firm words, where somebody is weakening and needs firm words to strengthen them. At other times, caring means quite soft and gentle words. Whichever way, through chanting Daimoku, we have the wisdom to know what we should do to really encourage and care for other people. So when he was giving this part of the lecture, Sensei said, our caring must extend both to non-members, to others we meet in our daily environment and society, as well as to members. Of course, there is no limit to where compassion should be used. And of course, Sensei himself, I think, is a really great example of this. He's constantly caring. He never meets one single person without in some way trying to help remove their unhappy karma. He's always thinking of other people. I was so amazed when I was last in Tokyo in January, and several of us met Sensei in a sushi restaurant in Tokyo. And at that time there were 4, I think, vice presidents there. And Sensei had obviously not seen them for a few days. Perhaps it was only a few hours, I don't know. Therefore, when he arrived in, having greeted everybody, he spent some time discussing things very quickly and rapidly with these people, these leaders, and then arranging for them to take action in various different ways. And Sensei, of course, does about 10 or 12 things at once always. So everything moves incredibly fast, and instructions are going out all over the place. But in the middle of all this, which was all planning and organization, he was also giving instructions for sushi lunches to be sent to about 12 different people who he had in his mind and knew were suffering in one way or another. So in the midst of all this whirl of instructions, which only went on for 5 minutes, but an incredible lot was done in it, there were also waiters rushing around, or rather chefs rushing around, preparing these sushi lunches, which were to be going off immediately to various people Sensei had in his heart. This is real caring, isn't it? Every minute of the day. Thank you, Ricky.
My disciples have been able to receive and embrace the Lotus Sutra by virtue of the strong ties they had formed with this teaching in their past existences. They are certain to attain Buddhahood in the future.
Thank you. There is a sutra which Sensei quoted in his lecture, which is called the Shinjikan. And this sutra states as follows. Many of you know the gist of it. If you want to know the cause you formed in the past, observe the effect in the present. If you want to know the effect in the future, observe the cause you are forming now. This is what Nichiren Daishonin is referring to here. The law of the cause and effect, a law of life, is eternal. It works eternally. In this sense, in another Gosho, Nichiren Daishonin says, past, present, and future are one, all linked by the law of cause and effect. If you want to know what your life was like in the past, look at what's happening to you now. If you want to know what your future life is going to be like, look at what you're doing now. So Nichiren Daishonin is saying that because of the strong ties that we had with the law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo in the past, we are able to embrace it now. Likewise, because of the practice we're doing now, we will embrace it in the future of our eternal lives. So in this way, the heritage of the ultimate law of life is passed from life to life. In the Lotus Sutra, it says, in lifetime after lifetime, they were always born together with their masters in the Buddha's lands throughout the universe. Really, the important thing about this is not the past connection. The important thing is the future. It's through meeting the Causton in this life, through the causes that we've made in a past life, that we then continue that heritage in our lives constantly and incessantly into the future. So, of course, these links are very mystic. But when you think about how you found the Causton, and you trace back your life up to that point, maybe the mysticism becomes a little clearer. So, I was once asked to write an experience of all my life, starting from babyhood upwards. And of course, in a sense it meant going backwards all the way through my life. And one could clearly see the extraordinary pattern of cause and effect working through that life, which I'd never thought about. I would never have considered it, even if I hadn't been asked to do this grueling task. But through doing that, I could see the causes and effects that I'd made in my life, which led me gradually, step by step, along quite a tortuous course to the Causton. This is the past connection which Nichiren Daishonin is talking about. There's another story which I've sometimes told, and some of you will have heard, about a Japanese girl who left Japan because her family constantly told her that she must chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. She decided the only way to escape was to get out of Japan altogether. So she flew to Los Angeles, and the first thing that happened to her as she walked out of the airport was someone said, "Have you ever heard of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo?" And then she got so fed up with NSA, who she met on every street corner, that she left for Europe. And she went first, I think, to this country, and the same thing happened to her here, though the membership was quite small at that time. And she then went to France, and the same thing happened. But then, believe it or not, she decided to escape to the mountains of Switzerland, and at that time there were only 6 members in Switzerland, but in Geneva she was challenged once again. And when she heard that there were only 6 members in Switzerland, she said, "I give up," and started to chant. But this is so fascinating, isn't it? This is truly the law of cause and effect. She had made the cause in her past to chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Her own selfishness, her own egoism was trying to make her to escape from it. But whichever way she went, that great cause held her. And eventually, of course, she started to chant, and she's now a very strong member. But it's a great indication of the way cause and effect actually works in life. So, continuing to chant, you can see, is vital. Sensei is always saying, don't backslide, never backslide. Why does he say it? It's not just because he wants a strong Soka Gakkai. This is Sensei's mercy. If we backslide, we cut the heritage, the chain of that heritage over many lives. We cut the good fortune that we may have been building over eons of eternal life. So to keep going, whatever, is vitally important. Nichiren Daishonin says, it's very easy to accept but often very difficult to continue. He's referring to the Causton. It's quite easy to go to the London office and receive a Causton, but it's quite difficult to continue. Why? Because the purpose of continuing is to achieve Buddhahood again in this life, just the same as you've achieved it in other lives, so that you can continue the heritage forward in life after life. And in the process, of course, help others around you to do the same. So this process is called planting, nurturing, and reaping. The seed of Buddhahood was sown in us in the distant past. And we nurture it in each lifetime through the causes we've made and the effects that exist in our lives, through chanting and carrying out the three practices. And then we reap the benefits of Buddhahood. So then you might say, well, what about the people who you meet who won't chant? You try everything, but they still won't chant. And Nichiren Daishonin's answer in the Gosho is that even if a person says one word of the Lotus Sutra or hears a line of the sutra being recited, this will continue the heritage. In other words, even though the person you talk to now may reject the whole thing and even get thoroughly angry with you, the seed that exists in that person has begun to be nurtured. And it's quite possible that at some other time, in a month, next week, in 4 years, even in 10 years, through a change in the circumstances of their life, that plant will actually begin to grow and they'll start chanting. So sowing seeds is very important. Telling others about Buddhism, not getting upset and depressed and irritable because people won't always chant. The important thing is, of course, to bring people to the Causton, but it's also vitally important that we sow seeds wherever we go.
The heritage of the Lotus Sutra flows within the lives of those who have never forsaken it in any lifetime whatsoever, whether in the past, the present, or the future.
Right, thank you. So at the beginning of this Gosho, you remember, Nichiren Daishonin said that the ultimate law of life is Myoho Renge Kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra, which also contains its essence. Therefore, to chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, devoting, in other words, your life to it, is inheriting the law. So that first moment you chant is in every sense the most incredibly important moment of your life. The moment you first say Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, you have inherited this law in this lifetime, just as you've inherited it in countless lifetimes before. And through your subsequent practice, you will make the causes to inherit it in every single lifetime, in whatever planet in the universe you may exist. Sometimes people feel that moment. I think nearly in every sense people feel that moment. Certainly for myself, it was a moment I shall never, never forget. Because on that day, Mitsuko, my wife, had gone to the head temple to see the Daigohonzon. And in my heart, I felt what she was doing very deeply. And I wanted to go with her, but of course I couldn't. I'd never even chanted once at that time. But I asked her before she left what time she would be before the Daigohonzon, and she told me. And I went to the Butsudan and lit the candles and a stick of incense. For the first time ever, I shall never forget it. At a few minutes before the time that Mitsuko was in front of the Daiga Hongzun. And I opened the doors for the first time on my own, and I chanted Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. That to me was an unforgettable moment. When I read this Gosho, I understand why. Because it was that moment that I inherited the ultimate law of life. At that time, I just felt I was doing something incredibly important. But this Gosho really makes it live for me. So probably many of you too had some amazing feeling at that time. So when we inherit the law of life, there is no special ceremony. We inherit the law of life as ordinary human beings living our own ordinary lives. But nevertheless, that moment is incredibly important. And I think this emphasizes again how much we must make sure to give other people the chance to inherit Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. Unless we speak, unless we sow seeds, other people do not have that chance. This is incredibly selfish, isn't it? So really we should speak with joy. And through reading this Gosho, maybe, we can understand more deeply than ever how necessary Shakabuku is. Not just to change our own karma, but also to give happiness to others through them being able to inherit this law.
Those who disbelieve and slander the Lotus Sutra will destroy the seeds for becoming a Buddha in this world. Because they cut themselves off from the potential to attain enlightenment, they do not share the ultimate heritage of life, of faith.
Thank you. We'll make this the last paragraph for today. Well, the Buddha state is, of course, in everybody. But to achieve enlightenment and actually maintain it once you've achieved it means, I believe, without arrogance, that you must chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. There is no other way of achieving and sustaining or maintaining enlightenment. Why? Because to sustain enlightenment, to sustain the Buddha state as the main tendency of your life, you have to still do battle with the lower six worlds, especially the three evil paths. And this requires life force. And I know of no other way to generate life force except through chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So let's think about that. Let's not be in the least arrogant about the teachings that we are now beginning to understand. But truly, I believe this is the absolutely only way, and the only way that you can rid the three poisons for this from this world: greed, anger and animosity, and ignorance, is by making sure that other people are able to inherit this law. There is no other way of maintaining Buddhahood, and there is no other world which is strong enough to resist the pull of the lower states of life. These are the facts of the matter. So what we're doing now, at this moment, is incredibly important, isn't it? I know you're all doing your utmost to try to tell others about Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. I know there's a great deal of shakabuku going on in a quiet way. which I believe is the right way. And we'll really see the benefit of this as we have the joyful chance to watch those people that we shakabuku growing in strength and in faith and really starting to show joy in their lives. So, just to conclude, I believe, to summarize the essence of what we've talked about today, Buddhism, or rather Buddhahood, firstly, I believe, is freedom. This is what we're struggling towards. To be free from our unhappy karma. To be free from fear, because we know we're always protected. And to be free from disappointment, because of the limitations of our imagination, because of the Hongamyo spirit, the backward-looking spirit, which so many people have. Through attaining Buddhahood, we find those three freedoms, and they mean, when put together, freedom of life. The freedom to really challenge life, knowing that we're always protected, knowing that if we put our minds or our ichinen towards it, there is nothing that we cannot achieve. And through this, creating value and happiness wherever we go. This is Buddhahood in this life. It sounds simple. It's very difficult to achieve. It means always continuing the three practices, come what may. But if we do that without fail, step by step, naturally and smoothly, definitely we will find this freedom. Thanks very much for listening. Many thanks.